are ready to start panel 3. Panel 3 is on contributing factors and considerations and decision time horizon. On this panel, we have Melissa Burchard, Director for Clean Energy and Grid Reform, Acadia Center; James Daly, Vice President of Energy Supply, Eversource Energy; Liz Delaney, Senior Director of Wholesale Market Development, New Leaf Energy; Tom Dunn, President and CEO, Vermont Electric Power Company; Pallas Levenskike, Vice President, Potomac Economics, ISO New England External Market Monitor; Margie Phillips, Senior Vice President, Wholesale Market Power, LS Power; and Patrick Woodcock, Commissioner, Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. We also have a misplaced cell phone. It is at this table. If it is yours, you may claim it at the end of this panel. Chairman Glick.
Thank you, Mary. I think we're going to raffle off the phone if no one claims it. Hopefully we'll pay the LNG expenses for the upcoming year. We're going to go in a different order again this panel and start with Commissioner Clements with her questions.
That is very generous of you. Thank you. So I was reflecting a little bit at lunch on, and thank you to all of you first for coming. This is a great discussion so far, and appreciate getting educated on some of these things. I was reflecting on the conversations from this morning and thinking about this near-term conversation. And you think about the fact that LDCs are contracting for LNG capacity, that pipelines benefit from the LNG capacity and its impact on the pipelines, that electric generation benefits from being able to buy non-firm gas on these pipelines. And I also appreciated Commissioner Danley's line of questioning to really get at what is the FERC role in this near-term piece. And so from that perspective, I'm open. There's a lot of players who can get together relative to how we manage the near-term acute risk. Again, we don't have data demonstrating how acute it is or how long that near-term risk is going to last or projections around that. So I'm certainly interested to the extent that there is a FERC role to play in open to what that might look like. I think I don't want that, though, to impede the pieces of the conversation around the medium and the long-term solutions to this problem, because that's the place where we start the conversation today, or we continue after many restarts and efforts, the conversation today about how we get at the portfolio solutions going forward. And so I guess I'd start with that in mind to talk about markets a little bit, market design, and to say, how's it going on the ISO New England capacity market right now? Is the accreditation stakeholder process kicked off? Is it working? Do we need to be thinking about seasonal capacity markets? Is the winter reliability risk that we are going to continue to face in some version? It'll be different because the resource mix will continue to change in the medium and longer term. Is that winter reliability risk somehow captured already? Or should we be thinking about some combination of seasonal capacity market, accreditation, maybe tightening the pay for performance efforts? I appreciate getting people's perspectives on how you think that's going so far, or where the needs are. Hi, go ahead, Marjorie.
Margie Phillips with LS Power, and just to give a little bit of background of where I'm coming from, we own transmission, we own C-Power, demand response. In New England, we own wind, solar, and 2 natural gas plants. So I can respond to a lot of questions asked earlier as well. But I think you raised a couple of really good issues. That one thing that was concerning me about the discussion is there do have to be holistic changes, and we do think it's a market. I agree with Commissioner Danley, it's not a conventional market, but it's a set of rules designed to mimic markets and to take advantage of them. We need regulatory oversight and market monitoring and all that, but there are market aspects of it that will be beneficial to consumers. So I'd like to let me start with the seasonal, because that was one of the ones you raised. And the concern is I'm going to put my Mr. Dickerson hat on and be really, really honest here. And it's all about price, and it's all about insurance, and nobody wants to pay for it. So the problem with the seasonal product is you may allow more of solar in the summer and winter and wind in the winter, but you still are not accommodating the need to compensate dispatchable resources. Because regardless of the season, they're going to need an annualized return, right? Doesn't matter, I mean, maybe they make more money in the summer or more in the winter. At the end of the day, they need an annualized return. And so the seasonal capacity market is great for incenting additional energy resources, but not necessarily the kind of resources that you need for energy security. Because going back to the first panel, you're really going to need dispatchable resources for that. But I think in terms of market design, ISO New England is on the right road. Accreditation is really important, and frankly, it needs to be reformed for all resources. I don't want to get into the complaint, but it's a valid concern, and we can talk a little bit about, there was some discussion about accrediting resources differently dependent on their fuel situation, which I'd love to talk to, but I don't want to monopolize my answer. Take too much time. But the other thing is market reform is penalties and incentives, which is, we don't have enough to pay for performance, and so you're right, it's a bit of a gamble. So what's the balance between penalties and incentives? And then finally, really, it boils down to cost recovery, because what we're talking about is an insurance product, and we keep talking about affordability, and insurance is never fun to pay for, and you always think you overpaid until the day your house burnt down. And that's what we're dealing with here, is we have to develop a product that I think, and my company thinks, markets are well positioned to respond to, but we have to very specifically identify what's the issue. There's not a regional problem. Not all resources have this problem. So we need to identify it, then agree who's going to pay for it. And that can be done on a short-term basis, a product that's quickly developed, and then a more holistic approach like you've referred to.
It seems to me that if you have a market signal, it can skip over some of those things, because the idea that there's one version of a resource that could provide whatever the product is not necessarily right. If you're incenting both the need to show up, and as well as the idea that a reduction in winter peak demand would have value in it, those things together seem valuable.
I think what you need to do when you're developing this product is first identify what you're specifically solving for. I mean,
Right,
you've heard instances that ISO has done some studies, but I think as Tom said in the first, Tom Caslow in the first panel, we need to see more information. What is it we're specifically studying? My company did a rough estimate, and we could tell you exactly. We don't want to, rat out our colleagues, but it's pretty obvious who has fuel and who doesn't, and what are we tailoring this for? Are we tailoring it for longer run or shorter run? Battery storage can solve a 4-hour. You're going to need a longer dispatchable. So it's about getting the attributes right, and then determining, do you want a single product? Do you want multiple products? And that's where I think it addresses your concern of not continuing to pay for capacity when the resources isn't giving you energy security. But that's different than steel in the ground, right? And that's kind of what this discussion's about.
Yeah, you're singing my tune. What are we trying to solve for?
Yeah.
We can go left to right. Mr. Daly?
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, for the opportunity to speak with you. My responsibilities cover both power and natural gas at Eversource Energy. So to give you a perspective on where we're at, so we started last year, about this time last year, discussing with ISO the problems going into the winter, and that costs had risen substantially for customers, and we were trying to manage a high-cost situation. ISO further informed us that reliability was going to be precarious because of fuel supply last winter. So this spring, we decided to engage early with ISO and said, look, can we avoid the precarious fuel supply situation in the coming winter by provisioning properly for fuel? And ISO undertook a study, said, we'll let you know where it is. So they undertook the study that you've all seen in presentations. The result was that this winter, we should be all right if it's a mild winter. Even if it's a normal winter, we should get by with some emergency actions. but that under severe winter conditions, supply will remain precarious. And what's more, it'll be that way for the next number of years beyond the RMR in the Everett Marine Terminal. So we said, well, that doesn't sound very good. I mean, we as utilities responsible for, in our case, 4.4 million customers, we have to message that to our customers. It was not well received last year and won't be this year either in terms of high prices. And the prices this winter are going up 60 to 100% over what they were last winter. So we have a very serious situation on our hands that warrants action. And fuel is the problem. It is not a very complex problem to solve, but kudos to ISO. They produced the report, the problem statement. But I'll point out one thing in it, that it identifies the Everett Marine Terminal as being required longer term beyond the RMR. But today we have the Everett Marine Terminal and still supply is precarious. So it points the direction that we need to go, but more is needed than the Everett Marine Terminal. So maybe the strategic reserve is part of that solution that needs to be explored. But to step back from all of this for a minute, we were in this situation before in New England. Back in the early 2000s, we had a reliability problem in Southwest Connecticut, and we had a big RMR problem. Generation was not in sufficient quantities and not in the right places. So what you folks did, or your predecessors, was mandated RMR agreements for a lot of generation. So we're starting on a trend right now that would head in that direction if that is a solution. We want to avoid that, obviously. It was very expensive, but we got out of it by contracting for more generation in Southwest Connecticut. The states actually, through us, contracted. We put those power plants under contract, caused them to be built, and built a lot of transmission to move the power around the place. So we've been here before in terms of solutions. I'd like to think we've learned something from this process, but by building a lot of transmission to relieve the bottlenecks and by building the generation in the right place, we were able to solve the problem. The problem is a little bit different this time. States don't want to build fossil fuel generation, which we did back then. They want to build renewable generation. So it's a different technology, it's in different locations, but the solutions could be very similar. It's supply, as everybody said on the earlier panels, but we need transmission to that supply. And as a transmission company, there are solutions we can advance pretty fast through our existing transmission corridors, through augmenting the transmission arrangements, the transmission infrastructure we have today. We just agreed with our colleagues at Avangrid to do a big expansion down in Southwest Connecticut in the Cape Cod area to offload offshore wind. And it was a cost-sharing arrangement in which we augment supply in the region as well as cater for the new generation. So there are some very fast solutions that we can implement in this area, but it involves a combination of transmission and generation in the right places. I say we've been there before. We can solve this problem again. It really requires us to move forward on what's pretty expeditious and urgent and get agreement. But I think you folks can really help in terms of moving that along. And you did the last time in terms of making that solution happen. I think you can do it again.
Thank you. Ms. Delaney?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So first off, I think I want to compliment you all for taking the time to delineate the issues and talk about near-term versus medium-term versus long-term. We've run a risk in this conversation today and in the past of kind of conflating what we see right in front of us with what might come in the future. So when we talk about the near-term risks, I've learned from my esteemed colleagues who have been around for a long time that this is a long-standing issue, right? So we've had a shift from dispatchable thermal resources with on-site fuel to dispatchable resources without on-site fuel. And that just-in-time resource, those just-in-time fuels are limited. And so we focused this morning about trying to solve for that, but a lot of different problems came up that are longer term, which is about renewable intermittency and concerns about reliability in the future. Now, it's interesting to me that renewable energy, clean energy resources are actually a solution to the first problem. the more that we can relieve the pressure on the pipes by putting new resources in the ground that do not need that fuel, the better off we are for the winter. However, the concerns we have about longer-term issues are real, and we need to advance them. So to your question, Commissioner Clements, that's where the markets come in. And if you ask, how is the ISO doing? They're doing great, but there's a lot to do, right? So we've kicked off the capacity accreditation effort. It is still early days. I'm very hopeful that through that process, we will be able to accurately reflect the constraints of the fuel system in our capacity accreditation efforts. That would be a huge win in terms of ensuring reliability for this region. But there is more that we need to do. The efforts that you all have made on transmission and interconnection reform are critical. The faster we can get the newer resources onto the grid, the better off we are. And interconnection is slow and transmission is difficult. We talk about expanding gas infrastructure. Quite honestly, I think we have a better chance at transmission than we do expanding gas infrastructure, but I'm not opposed to putting all options on the table, but we need to be realistic about the resources and attention that it deserves. The winter fuel security issue has been a very important conversation, but we're taking our eyes off the prize. We need to resolve it. We need to resolve the near-term issue, and it's complicated, but at the same time, simultaneously, we need to be focused on the market solutions that are going to get us through the energy transition. The final thing I'll say is probably a little bit of a niche opportunity that we have, which is around battery storage. So when I talk about conflating issues near term and longer term, I know that we're talking about winter reliability. Short duration battery storage does have a role to play in supporting winter reliability. It's not the end all and be all, and there's going to be a need for long duration storage as well, but we have miles to go in terms of being able to understand how to optimize battery storage to resolve the year-round intermittency concerns that we have, which would narrow some of the concerns that we're talking about today and perhaps allow us to come up with a more solvable problem statement. Thank you.
Thanks for ending on that. That's a good thing to add to your set of questions or should we be sending, for example, different incentives for pump storage, longer term technology storage? What is the, as part of the market considerations?
Okay, yeah, I'll try to wrap that in. So, so there's definitely a need for capacity market reforms. The current capacity market is designed to meet the planning requirements of the system under a summer peak condition, and it's done that well. We even have surplus capacity in the summer, but it's really not designed to meet the reliability needs of the system in the winter. Each resource has potentially different characteristics by season. The demand's different. And so really there are reforms that are needed to adapt it to not just meeting summer requirements, but also winter requirements. And so that and if you have a capacity market that actually goes and procures what your planning requirements are, I don't think we should still be in the cycle of wondering if the lights are going to stay on. I mean, I think the example of ERCOT has been instructive in that if you don't have a capacity market and you don't, engage with a market that's designed specifically to meet your planning requirements, you're going to wonder ahead of each peak season whether you're going to keep the lights on, even with very strong incentives. So whether it's ERCOT's strong reserve demand curve incentives, or in New England, PFP undoubtedly helps give stronger incentives, but that's not the same thing as a planning requirement that's met through the capacity market that specifies the amount of resources that are needed. So, I think we've proposed specific reforms to the capacity market that would do that. We think you could move it from its current forward annual design to a spot seasonal design, where the time frame in which generators are firming up their capacity through, oil supply contracts or LNG contracts would be the time frame in which you would conduct this auction ahead of each season. So, we think that would just be a more effective way to procure resources to make sure you have what you need before the winter. It's doing it in a non-discriminatory fashion is also helpful, because to the extent that other technologies can help, that's great. It's going to reduce the amount of oil and gas that's needed. But it's important to do it in a way that doesn't select specific resources to subsidize, because subsidies for one solution or type of resources is ultimately going to undermine investment incentives in all of the other technologies, right? So we've been talking about the importance of LNG, but there's actually a lot more of the resources that are provided in the winter are going to come through oil, and the ISO gentleman showed that it's going to require a lot of replenishment. If 30% of your capacity has relatively small fuel tanks, you're going to need financial incentives for those firms to resupply. And just because they have oil ahead of the winter doesn't mean that they have it in the quantities that are going to be needed. So anyways, we think that the improvements to the capacity market are, at this point, the best opportunity is through the capacity accreditation reforms. I mean, it gives you an opportunity to differentiate between dispatchable resources according to the levels of fuel supply that they have, and really, I think that provides the best framework for doing that. That we can
Just
see.
one follow-up, appreciating the tension between near-term kind of out-of-market actions that may be taken and the impact of those actions potentially distorting the market signals in the way we may hope they move or want them to move. Is there, do you have a perspective on whether or not this needs to be kind of a comprehensive set of actions, if kind of doing one of these strengthening PFP or pay for performance, or thinking about accreditation, or thinking about seasonal capacity? Is it something like, should we be 206ing and saying, let's look at the whole picture together? Or is it something that you could do, you could see how the capacity accreditation process plays out, and that's going in a good direction? Do you have a perspective on that?
I think that there are things that you can do that are helpful, but I'd say that clearly the centerpiece should be capacity market reforms in the time frame where that can actually help. That simply procure what's needed for the winter, right? Now, at the same time, you could get some benefit out of other reforms, things like PFP, I said earlier, provide incrementally better incentives. I mean, undoubtedly resources are more ready than they would be if you didn't have PFP, but that's supplemental in nature, not something that can be the primary solution.
Thanks, and I just have one more question for Ms. Burchard. My favorite topic, demand side. To me, there was a comment made that we could do some work around the margins. It seems to me like the opportunity is bigger than that. If you think about any of the emergencies over the last 2 years, it's really been customers that have come to save the day, and that's not systematic, it's not planned for. And I know all of the limitations. If you're talking about day 6 of a very cold stretch, turning down the thermostat's not particularly attractive. But in any case, that seems to be some piece of the puzzle, and I'm curious if you have a perspective on the opportunity for demand-side resources to play a role in the appreciating we're now onto the medium to longer term.
Thank you. Yes, glad to be here today, Commissioner Clements, as well as all of the commissioners who've convened this important discussion. So I really appreciate the effort to distinguish between the near term, the medium term, and the long term. I think that's extremely constructive and appreciate that. I, like everyone else in the room and others who are not here, am concerned about the near-term need to keep the lights on in the winter, but also concerned about the long-term needs to have a flourishing and successful clean energy transition. I am worried about the same thing that Liz just mentioned, which is this tendency to conflate the two in some cases. And the current system relies on gas for 53% of its electricity generation and only 12% on the category classified as renewables. So we're really talking about a gas over-reliance situation in the near term, and 10, 15, 20 years out, we're talking about something else. With respect to just your prior question, just very briefly, not much to add on top of what others already said, except just to mention, one of the things that these two things do have in common, the near term and the medium and long term, is really overcoming the kind of legacy of discrimination in the markets against clean energy. We are still working to overcome that. And that's still a challenge, and it's put us in part where we are today, and it's going to be affecting us for some years to come. I am hopeful that the current market reforms will help. I think it's a continuing challenge at this moment to have that level playing field. In terms of solutions that we can turn to, including demand response, that is, those clean energy solutions are where we should be turning to first. I guess it's another commonality between the near term, medium term, and long term. To turn to those demand side solutions first, because they tend to be the cheapest, the quickest, and the cleanest. They provide benefit to New Englanders while also providing benefit to the electric system. So in terms of the near term, we actually have programs that could be, we're using them in the summer, but we're not using them in the winter. If we tweaked them in a very short term, we could be getting more benefit out of those programs, specifically for winter reliability. And then in terms of medium and longer term, we've got, I think Ms. Tepper is probably the one who mentioned it earlier today, a huge capacity for things like flexible load. As we electrify, let's not lose the benefits of that electrification. We have a huge opportunity with flexible load. We have not tapped demand response anywhere near the extent that we can. So we've got these really very largely untapped resources that are here now, but also more to come as we go through this process of the energy transition. And they can provide low-cost, cost-effective benefits with all sorts of additional community benefits for low-income residents of the region, for environmental justice communities, for all of us, including the electric system and its reliability. So turning to the fossil fuel solutions first is not tenable. It hasn't been working. And we need to start with the clean energy solutions, with things like demand response being first and foremost, because they are very tangibly beneficial for the electric system, as has been proven repeatedly in the past in New England, but also in other regions, to meet their reliability needs. And they are consistent with state climate policy and other goals. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you all. Sorry, Mr. Dunn, and then Margie, Ms. Phillips. Sorry.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner Clements. I also just want to say welcome to Vermont. I'm Tom Dunn, CEO of Vermont Electric Power Company. We are a transmission-only utility, one of the first in the nation, owned by all of the distribution utilities in Vermont, including IOUs, co-ops, and munis. We are a for-profit institution that returns those profits to all of Vermont ratepayers. So all of Vermont ratepayers benefit from the way VELCO operates. I wanted to speak to the DSM. In terms of looking at this winter situation, we have signed on to the problem statement. We are very concerned, obviously, about where we are, and there's been a lot of conversation about that this morning. But in looking at solutions, this is very much, particularly in the medium, longer term, this is very much a portfolio of options. And I'll spend more time talking about transmission later, I hope. But I wanted to speak to the DSM question only because this came up in Vermont a couple of years ago. There was a question about the effectiveness of the DSM programs on controlling demand. And we don't implement any DSM programs. That's done primarily by Efficiency Vermont and Vermont Gas. But we looked at the question of what were the effects over a long-term period of the continued energy efficiency programs that we've been doing in Vermont for a number of years. And one of the things that we prepare every 3 years is a 20-year transmission plan. And a key element to that plan is the load forecast. And so we asked ourselves, what has been the effects of all of the years of energy efficiency in Vermont? And Vermont's about 1,000 megawatt peak. And what we came to is that those programs have reduced Vermont's peak probably by 100 megawatts over about a 10-year period. So they are effective, and in particular, they're really effective too. One of the true benefits, and we've talked a little about low-income customers, making low-income customers' homes warmer and more comfortable is an enormous benefit, along with saving them electric energy. So a lot of other solutions out there, but I just wanted to share that experience that we've had.
I was just going to tie my answer a little bit to what Commissioner Danley was talking about, which is what FERC can do on demand side, and in New England, not very much. There was a stakeholder initiative to try and get a larger demand response program integrated into the wholesale market, and it failed. And it failed primarily because the states felt that their state programs were better and more efficient. I'm not opining, as a company that wanted it in the wholesale market, we're disappointed. I'm not opining on one or the other, but this is, I don't think, an area where FERC is going to get much traction. It really is incumbent on the states. They have very strong demand response programs. Hopefully, the states have strong incentives. I know with the Infrastructure Act, I'm installing better windows, and hoping that I get a tax rebate on that, and I think that's where the states come in. But I think FERC in New England, there are other areas you may be able to have more influence on demand response, but I think in New England it's been a very state-driven approach.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Commissioner Phillips?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Phillips, I'll stay with you for a moment. You mentioned earlier that you are an electric generator, and I'm a little interested, we're talking about sort of what are some of the factors that you consider in your decision making. I want to talk about contracting. In particular, can you talk about whether or not you have firm contracts with your generator, and whether or not, how does that matter? How does that factor into your decision?
So I think you've hit on the heart of this issue and why we think, having a hard stop on firm fuel requirements is not a great move for consumers. So we have two gas plants. We've got a peaking plant, Wallingford in Connecticut, and it actually has very little firm gas. It's never called ahead and day ahead, and we have performed with excellence in real time. So let me tell you what we do. We know when we're going to get called on, and we call around to our gas suppliers, and they give us a price, and we give that price in. So that goes back to it's all about price and cost and a willingness to pay for it. So we get a cost from them, and that's how we bid it in to the market. And in real time, we know they have told us we're going to get gas. By the way, if they tell us that they can't get gas at any cost, we're required to tell ISO New England that, or it's market manipulation. So just to be clear, in New England, to use a real estate term, it's location, location, location. And where we are on the pipeline system does not require firm, and yet customers are getting every single bit of worth from the capacity payment they're paid for. Our other generator is Ocean State in Rhode Island, and it's a dual fuel. And there we do have firm gas, but we also contract for fuel. And I did want to answer somebody's question about why don't you go for 100%? And it's the obvious, which is, if it's a mild year, I'm stuck with excess inventory. And this goes back to I'm a one-tune today. You're looking at an insurance policy. If you want me to carry 100%, and you're willing to help me bear the risk of that decision because you're taking it out of right? The whole point of a market is I make the risk assessment, and so maybe I only fill my tank 80%. But if that doesn't make you comfortable and you want to be insured, that other 20%, then you need to make me whole. So that's why it's about the money and the way I manage it, and then having strict penalty performances and accreditation, which should capture my performance if I've made a bad decision, should help align the way this is done. And if you look at the system, there are some generators out there who have really lousy access to gas, and they've been very open in stakeholder meetings that they contract for LNG. It's the way they know they're going to perform. Other people make the decision not to. So the point is, that's why we need to figure out what the problem is, because there's some units that have access to gas and can manage it or make the decision to procure LNG, and the point is, which are the units that may be getting overcompensated or need a different kind of incentive, depending on your perspective of this, to actually get the fuel. So.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Daly, you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important to distinguish between what happens on an average winter's day versus an extreme cold day. And this is the issue. So when people talk about gas being available for power generation, they're not talking about extreme cold days. which is what we're concerned about here today. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? If there was gas available all the time, there wouldn't be a problem. There is a problem, and it's because there isn't capacity available on the New England interstate pipelines on extreme cold winter's day, other than for the heating load, which has been contracted by companies like ourselves, our gas LDC companies that have firm transportation for our firm customers. And that leaves little or no spare capacity on the interstate pipelines. I mean, this is a well-known fact. Otherwise, as I said, we wouldn't be here. So it depends on what day you talk about and what power plant can run and can't run. And we need LNG on the peak cold winter days, and this is what a lot of this conversation has been about. We need LNG on peak cold winter days for power generation because there's nothing available on the pipes, and facilities like Repsol, the Everett Marine Terminal, the Accelerate facility offshore, these are the ones that are providing the power into the gas for power into the system on the coldest winter days. So that's the issue we have. And, the question Ms. Clements asked earlier is, what can we do short term? And, we asked ISO that and whether we should put the inventory energy program in place or the winter oil program in place for this winter. And their answer was, well, the market is performing okay for moderate to cold not so cold weather conditions. People are buying oil to fill tanks, and we'll know more later in the year. About end of October, November. We'll know how they're provisioning for those. But the word was that the reason the market's working okay is because it's relatively, I say cheap. It's not cheap to buy oil these days, but there's significant margins to be made between the cost of oil to generate on oil versus the gas clearing price. You could make $100 a megawatt hour. That's a huge margin by provisioning with oil versus the clearing price for power at the moment. That's what's driving our power prices to our customers. Is LNG, the LNG influence and the demand that's being caused in Europe by the war in the Ukraine is heavily influencing it. So even this time last year, we weren't looking at this market situation. So it can change very, very fast. But we are looking at a situation which there isn't enough supply, which in the winters that we need to be provisioning for, we as electric companies, transmission and distribution companies, and in the power generation side as well, I include ISO and our state representatives, they want a system that's reliable and that's going to perform on those very cold winter days. So we need to provision every year for a very cold winter day, and a very cold winter spell. Not that, hey, it might happen and then maybe we're all right. We should have ordered that ships, sure, hindsight's great. The thing you could do today is to make that assessment that we need to cover the insurance that has already been identified as missing for this coming winter by ordering up more ships of LNG to be here in the wintertime. And if that's not done today, you can't do it in January. You just don't have the time to get the supply here. So this is a decision that's before us today. We'd like this to have been made last May when we came out of the winter, but with the processes that we're following, and very necessary to involve everybody here today, but we're cutting off options fast. And the less action we take going forward into the winter, the less flexibility we have to meet these cold winter days. So you can ask yourself today, what could I do? And then in January, when the lights go out because we had hit a severe cold spell, and you say, well, what should we have done back then? And you don't want to be in the January situation like ERCOT was. And that's what we should be avoiding. Those are things you could do today.
Thank you for your comments. Ms. Phillips, do you want to have a clarifying point?
James, you just sent me a softball. I was talking about extreme days. It really does depend on where you are on the pipeline. That's why these generalizations that we don't have enough fuel are simply not true. It depends on where you are on the system. And that's where some additional analysis from ISO New England might be very helpful, because our plant has performed during extreme weather events and when the system has been constrained, but again, it's where you are. I'm glad we agree on the insurance aspect, and I just wanted to point out the interesting There is a willingness for states to rate base very expensive LNG contracts on the LDC side. Many of them have these expensive option contracts, that's what makes them expensive, right? If you were taking it every day ratably, they wouldn't be so expensive. The problem is we only have 10, 15 days a year. And so in the electric industry, there's a great reluctance to pay for that. And yet on the gas side, the states don't have any reluctance on paying it for the LDCs. And that's where we need to be grown-ups in the room and talk about there is a price for this reliability. We want to find a way that the market can make it most beneficial to consumers. SE maybe was a lot of money with not a lot of benefits, so we need to come up with something better perhaps. But that's really what we're talking about here. Thanks.
I see Commissioner Wistop, you have your card up. I was coming to you anyway, so I'm going to throw you another question in there. You can deal with them as you will. We're still talking about factors, right? And really, what do you take into consideration when you make your decisions? And the reason I wanted to talk to you, and I should have put this to Commissioner Allen when he was up here too, because we have a regulator from the region in the room, and I said I wanted to hear about reliability tools, and I wanted to hear about affordability. Can you tell me a little bit about your thinking on managing affordability for consumers, and you can also address the previous question as well.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. First of all, I have heard an unsatisfactory response for what FERC can do in the short term. And I think articulated in the 6 New England Governor's letter to Secretary Granholm, we're commencing one of those today, and that's coordination. This system has been fragile, and the acute severity of LNG that is being secured in Europe for national security regions has really put this market that we've relied on to as a product that is unavailable in many terms at a price that can be reasonably secured for our customers. Second thing was we're seeing a deluge of U.S. LNG traveling to Europe. That cannot be transported into New England because of Jones Act restrictions. I think FERC, including DOE, Homeland Security, needs to develop what are the protocols where there would be a recommendation to the President to issue a Jones Act waiver, given the conflict in Europe. And third, and it's been touched on, thank you, Commissioner Christie, is I see what's happening in California, what happened in Texas. I think market reforms that all of us have articulated are going to be imperative, yet there are limitations to those reforms. And that is a consequence of what Chairman Glick stated, that we have these events that are occurring that were rare, that are becoming increasing and very hard to make arrangements to provide resource adequacy. I think this country has always recognized that energy is an imperative. That's why we created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We have the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve in the Northeast, as we were reliant on heating oil. I think if you look at the last few years, it cries out to say we need more insurance for these low probability, high risk events where the consequences on our residents is catastrophic. So I do think that FERC could have a role there. I think it's talking about the composition of a strategic energy reserve in each RTO, including New England, and I think it would look very different in the Northeast or other RTOs. Structurally, what kind of jurisdiction does this look like? I think, as you mentioned, Commissioner Christie, you could look at it as state jurisdictional. You could look at it as operated by DOE, which we have for the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, or we could look at under the Federal Power Act, is there any ability there? So I do think there are some near-term steps. I do think, however, what is in my mind is on ISO's description of the 2017-2018 cold snap. And I remember that very well. I remember the frostbite that I got as I was talking to ISO about the depletion of our energy reserves. That was a 1 in 100-year event, and I really do not see market arrangements really being adequate to ensure that generators will make arrangements for that event. And we were really on the cusp. If there was another N-1 event, lost a nuclear power plant, we were at the point where we were going to have to really start talking about contingencies and rolling blackouts in New England. That's what we need to prepare for.
Thank you for your comments. My time is almost up. I'll give you the final word, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to comment on some of the things I've heard. This notion that we need more insurance. I mean, I think basically we need some insurance because right now that we don't have insurance. The notion of or we have reliability standards that are based on being, having resources there if we have an above extreme type of weather event. So, right now we're not incentivizing people to have more than what they expect in a 50-50 year. If you want to have reliability during an extreme weather event, you just have to incorporate those additional standards into the capacity market. And then when you procure the resources, procure them on the basis where you're paying them differently if they have fuel versus if they don't.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Commissioner Phillips. Commissioner Danley.
Thank you. So, Mr. Daly, you, assuming that your premise you had before of more transmission is going to be part of this, what exactly is it that you would want FERC to do? What specific thing? Because you said that we could be helpful. Transmission, more intermittence. What exactly is it that you want us to do?
Yes, thank you for the question. So, as a transmission and distribution company, one of the solutions we can offer long term, because it takes time to get these sited and built, is transmission to renewables. So transmission to new imports of renewables, both to Hydro-Quebec and to New York, and to expedite the process of approving those. Transmission within New England. You recently approved a tariff that we put together for transmission expansion in the Southwest to bring offshore wind through Cape Cod. There's more of that. We're contracting for much more. My company is involved in thousands of megawatts of contracting for offshore wind. We need transmission takeaway capacity in the southwest of Massachusetts, but also in Connecticut. And there's opportunities in New Hampshire as well in terms of interconnections to our neighbors to the north. We can also expedite transmission expansion within existing corridors that take a lot less time than new routes to permit. We can increase the size of transmission capacity within those corridors as well without erecting new towers necessarily, by reconductoring and some reconstruction. But I think all of those needs to be expedited in terms of how we organize to bring those projects before you and within New England. ISO needs to complete the 2030 studies that it's in the process of doing, so we can identify which of those projects are the ones that we want to move forward with expeditiously to connect renewable resources into the load centers in New England. That's what we need to be doing in parallel with, we have short-term problems to solve in terms of fuel security, but so we don't spend years and years in those RMRs or whatever that comes out of that process, that we have viable transmission solutions to connect to viable renewable generation on track. I think there's large agreement within the region as to where we need to get to. What there isn't is how to get there. And as a transmission provider, we can provide solutions. And I'm not, I don't want to diminish the importance of other solutions here, like long-term storage, solar, onshore wind, or other resources, particularly energy efficiency and demand response. Not to diminish their importance. They all need to be part of it. But I think we need to move forward on some of these fronts. Some of them are transmission is not a new technology. We can build this. We know what it looks like. Some of the longer term resources like long-term storage.
You can build it, but you also have to get it permitted.
We also have to get it permitted.
Right.
Exactly right.
And right now, the state of the law at the moment is our powers extend basically to no more than setting rates. So given the fact that that's what we can do, and basically what we can do is lay out a giant platter of carrots for people and try to incentivize them to take all of the regulatory risks that attend a project being advanced, what else besides that can be done?
I would look to any of the
putting aside the fact that we have, a very complicated process of setting returns and the like, assuming that that's not the issue. But what can we do other than that?
There are cost-sharing issues which are paramount to getting more regional solutions in place. That's really, really important, and it's a nut that has not been cracked. I'm not going to diminish how difficult that is. There are also some transmission projects, and I won't mention the particular projects before you, but there are transmission issues that need to be resolved in order for them to get constructed. There's one large transmission project, one hydro import at the moment that's before you, that just needs to get resolved so that the owners can move forward with that. And I'm sure there are others if I go through them. So, you know, I think there are some low-hanging fruit that we can do with little enough intervention from you, other than expeditiously approve those tariffs, those cost-sharing arrangements. It does rely on agreement to who's going to pay for this.
It always comes down to that.
It does, doesn't it?
Everybody wants transmission, nobody wants to pay for it.
Exactly, yep.
And a lot of people don't want to cite it. So I was actually going to call on you next. I understand that transmission is needed and wanted, though again, who's going to pay for it? I have a very dim view of the likelihood of the kind of transmission build-out that people are talking about actually being achievable on anything like the timelines that would be necessary to achieve the reliability benefits. And I am worried that where you are, you probably have a particularly valuable view on whether you share my dim outlook on transmission build-out. Do you think it is as likely as we've heard from various people today, or do you think it's problematic, and why?
Sure, thank you for the question. I'm actually more optimistic about transmission build-out. Clearly, there's been a record of projects that have problems, but we have been doing transmission build-out in Vermont for 15-plus years. And our experience is guided there. An example of a project we built within the last 10 years, we permitted and built a 50-mile 345 line in Vermont and brought it in under budget. So it can be done. The other thing I would point to, and I think Mr. Daly hit on a lot of good points, is looking at transmission planning, and that is an immediate, I think, an opportunity. And by that, the system we have today reflects the planning that we used to do, that we've done historically. The opportunity in looking at planning to incorporate a broader set of values, I think is the direction we need to go as a region and as a country. We have done our own little part of that. And in this particular instance, I'm referring to a project that we are working on where we had to an asset condition with a 17-mile line, and we had to make an investment to replace some of those structures. And we said, and it happens to be in a part of Vermont that affects the ability of some renewable resources to run. And so we challenged ourselves to say, well, okay, if we have to spend this money, what else could we do on this particular project to maybe make a difference? And in this particular case, we are moving forward to not only replace those structures, but we're going to replace the wire, put in a more capacity line, and doing it we've been able to demonstrate that it has net benefits. It has lower losses. It has some real benefits of, particularly in terms of allowing those investments in renewable energy to run relatively unconstrained. We're not, we haven't built this line yet, but we're very confident that it's going to move forward. So I mean, I think the key is, I think building transmission in Vermont, spend a lot of time up front. And in fact, we've had projects where we've delayed it a year for permitting in order to have those conversations. Talking to having those relationships at the local level, understanding what they're looking for. In the project that I was thinking of, the 345 line, what we did is relocated a substation, a 345 substation. We got feedback at the local level that there was a gravel pit in the next town over. We had to do a lot of redesign work, but if you think about bringing a project that doesn't bring a lot of angry towns with it to the permitting process, that's a good thing. I mean, we learned that lesson. The first large transmission project that we did in about 25 years, I was a project manager, and I will tell you, we learned a lot of lessons because of how many angry people came to those hearings. And so it definitely falls into the what doesn't kill you makes you better. But I really am optimistic that done right, you can make these projects happen. The other element of that right-size project is it's in an existing 150-foot corridor. It's built in a horizontal configuration. When we rebuild it, we're going to rebuild it in a vertical configuration. And the reason I wanted to mention that is by doing that, we will clear up or free up space for a second line. So that is a big plus, particularly as we think about the opportunity to expand the transmission network. The only other thing I would mention in terms of transmission expansion, I mentioned earlier the portfolio approach. What I'm really intrigued about are if we're thinking about an energy reserve, is making it as resource neutral as possible. And by that, I'm thinking of the possibility of imports from Quebec, additional imports from Quebec, and maybe in combination with the ability to bidirectional trade energy on that particular facility, so that when we have excess wind in New England, we'd be able to move that power north, and when we need the power, would have in the wintertime and some of these constrained periods, would be able to call upon it.
So I had kind of expected you to be a little bit more optimistic than I was, which is why I asked you. Does anybody else share my dim outlook about this? I'm curious, because I just imagine what it would be like if I went to my bankers and said, hey, look at the track record of failure to build desperately needed transmission in this region that is fairly crying out for more transmission capacity. How about you loan me some money? Right? And I've never been in that position before. I've never done it. I just can't imagine that that would be received with anything other than a bit of an icy stare. So does anybody agree? I'm curious to hear thoughts.
Well, thank you for that recognition. I think I'm speaking for all customers that I think we're frustrated that it's not as if New England didn't see a challenge with our exposure to global LNG prices. We saw that in 2013 and 2014. As a result, we moved forward with hydroelectricity, perfect for winter capacity. Offshore wind, high capacity factor. And there were known risks at the time. I think it's fair to say that over the last 5 years since that authorization was approved, the risks have revealed itself in a magnitude that I didn't think we expected. And I think Congress has recognized that. I think there's a large recognition that if we are, every report that we've seen, including our own report, that the least cost decarbonization route is through a significant electrification, and the way to do that is through transmission, that there has to be public support for transmission. There just has to. And
I'm sorry, are you presuming to tell the public what to support here? I mean, this is part of the problem, is that what you just said is completely true. It must be supported, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be. And depending upon how the region's different actors act, you can find that even the most desperately needed thing is not going to move forward. I really am just skeptical that this is going to be as easy. Nobody's calling it easy. I don't want to be unfair to people. I don't know that it is as clear that that is going to get us out of the position we're in, having transmission built, knowing how much opposition there is to it. That's the point that I'm making here.
no, I think we have to be clear-eyed of what the kind of timelines are, how to think about permitting. We've certainly looked at using the federal highway system for permitting transmission. I think we have to be much more sensible. We certainly would have done things differently in retrospect, but that doesn't mean that we should shy away from that effort, Commissioner.
I can see you chomping at the bit, so.
Reality check, reality. I'm putting on my Sharon Segner hat, so those of you who know my colleague, we can build anything, just let us have at it. And we can do it on a competitive, cost-effective basis, so let us do it. My other point, though, again, I hate to inject reality into the discussion. All the transmission is not addressing what we're talking about, right? We heard the gentleman representing the NERC reliability region say we need dispatchable resources. So increasing this transmission system to bring in more intermittent clean resources is great on an everyday, every hour energy. It's not going to solve the problem when you have these extreme events and need dispatchable, because unless you're importing, the whole point is when you're in an event, depending where you are geographically, New York may not be able to give you the dispatchable resources that the transmission built for you. I'd also like to remind everybody that Hydro-Quebec is building a transmission line for this reserve product into New York, but guess what? It's a summer-only product, because in the winter, it gets, having gone to school in Montreal, I can tell you it gets super cold there. And so, again, it's not necessarily, transmission is a piece of this. I don't want to say it's not. One, I'm more optimistic than you that there are companies like ours out there who can get it done. But two, it's also not the ultimate solution.
So yeah, it is obvious that dispatchables are needed, and there's, even if you could just string wire everywhere to take care of reliability, the cost of that would be such that it would not be contemplated. So Mr. Daly, I had a question for you, but it seems like you want to respond to that first. So do you want to say that now?
Well, I was just trying maybe a suggestion in terms of things we could do to respond to transmission planning. It takes a long time, and the stakeholder process is necessarily very inclusive, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, as I've been saying, in terms of transmission that we could build. Our transmission people call them no-regrets solutions that they can implement. And some of these are in the ISO, I think nearly all of them are in the ISO planning process, this 2030 study they're looking at. Is there a way to say, hey, given the importance of some of these and their necessity in connecting new renewables so we can get ourselves off this dependency on LNG track, we need an expedited track on the transmission side. Give us your list of top projects coming, firstly, expedite that process and get it done, and give us a list of your top transmission projects that are coming out of that you're looking at. And further questions would be, why can't we get these done? What is preventing these from getting done? In other words, can FERC play a role in terms of expediting through the process of planning, so we come out of the other end with a selection of projects that the region could support? Clearly, you need support from the states as to who will pay for what. But we don't have the projects before us right now. They're all in the planning process. And what we need to do is get a topography of projects that say, these look like no regrets solutions. Let's get on with them and let's get them done. And is there a facilitating role FERC could play in that? Is
the facilitating role being what? That we batter eyes at the state decision makers to try to charm them into approving things faster? I'm being funny, but really,
give them a timeline and say, get these things before us, and tell us whether you agree or not with them. I mean, to get visibility at least on what we're talking about.
I for one would be reluctant to come on strong with the state.
Well, it may not be a come on strong, but it may be.
It's kind of their right under the FPA, not ours.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it may be not a come on strong. It's more, can we facilitate this process?
Yeah. Okay.
No, I'm sorry, you had another question?
Oh, I do actually, but I'm going to come back to it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I know you want to move on, but I did want to remind everybody that over the last 20 years, there's been a remarkable amount of transmission built out in the New England region. It's apparent in our RNS rates, and it's apparent when you look at LMPs. There's very little nodal separation in prices, with the exception of some areas in Maine. And what that signifies is a pretty robust transmission system that may not be future ready, but it certainly makes me believe that it's possible. Now, clearly we've had a very negative experience with the most recent large-scale transmission project that is still being explored in Maine, but I don't think we should let that completely dampen our perspective here, or perhaps allow us to shy away from what might be a more feasible solution than some of the other ones that are on the table.
So, of course, transmission has been built. That's why the lights are on at all. If we're talking, though, we're going to use Margie's paradigm of insurance here. One buys different amounts of insurance based on risk, and the risk is something that you try to figure out based upon empirical evidence. And you get more fire insurance if you're next to a forge than you do if you're in the middle of a pasture. And when you see the most recent experiences being bad ones, it kind of makes you think that this may not be the best path to take. That's all I'm saying, right? And I think that is probably an unarguable proposition I'm setting forth.
I think it's always smart to learn, but I will say that the transmission NOPR has some very innovative and new ideas that are worthy of exploring and give me a lot more optimism for the future.
I'm sorry, I've been neglecting you.
Thank you so much. I just want to jump on the optimism bandwagon. First of all, I appreciate the focus on transmission. I think it's an extremely important part of the puzzle. Acadia Center advances clean energy solutions, including clean energy, but also transmission. And, we are hopeful right now that we're moving in the right direction on transmission. In the recent past, we've had states trying to go it alone and solve this problem on their own. Right now, between the state's recognition that it's advantageous to work together, that multi-state coordination can provide a better multi-benefit projects between, the Commission's efforts to reform its rules, to better integrate state policy, and to take a longer look at, how we can reform the transmission system in a more sensible and cost-effective manner. We're really moving in a lot of the right directions. Communication is key. I hear Commissioner Woodcock's frustration, and I also hear, Mr. Dunn's, kind of wise words about, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and plugs in more communities, and make sure that we provide benefits, not just impacts, to all the states and all the communities. Now, Acadia Center actually just released with a number of partners a set of transmission principles. This was through New England for Offshore Wind, which is a coalition organization that includes all kinds of environmental organizations across New England, that includes labor groups, businesses and business associations. And this set of transmission principles is an effort to, it's much more likely to get this done than a pipeline, but it still requires a lot of buy-in and a lot of effort. And so these principles that we put forward are, they come out with the acronym BASICS, and that's what they are. We have some basics that we need to do. I think that Mr. Dunn has learned some lessons, and others have learned some lessons from failures in the recent past, and getting those basic things done, including providing benefits to communities, avoiding impacts on environmental justice communities. These basics can help us actually get the community engagement and investment that we need to move forward on projects that can provide benefits to the entire region.
Well, I hear the chorus saying that they're more optimistic than I am. I've registered my, go ahead. My time is up,
just quickly,
yeah.
We clearly think that transmission is a component. Don't get me wrong, though. We need fuel arrangements, and the market reforms that are being discussed. I actually heard some commonality here. One, I do think we need to have signals for fuel arrangements in the winter. That's effectively what the ESI program is designed to do. Secondly, I think we need multi-durational price signals to when we have a cold weather event, that we have signals to use those scarce fuels efficiently. Lastly, having capacity accreditation. I think we need to say that when you add a huge amount of capacity of one resource, there's a decline in market reforms as we start to see that New England's going to become a winter peaking system of how do we create new investments that actually works for the seasonality of that demand. So I do think those are four components that will need to be worked on by ISO, and should be coming to FERC in the coming years.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner Christie?
I want to follow up on Mr. Woodcock's statement about and commentary about the reliability reserve, the energy reserve, which is out of market. And by the way, Margie, I got to say this. You said these RTO markets are okay because they mimic real markets. And I would say they mimic real markets the way a lightning bug mimics real lightning. It's about how close they are. But but back to Mr. Woodcock. So you mentioned several ways of getting to this reliability reserve or energy reserve. I think the governor's called it energy reserve. And one of the things you said was DOE. I don't know why you went DOE involved, because I would just point this out. You as states today are free to share generating resources. It's not unusual for multiple states to have one generating resource that's jurisdictional to multiple states. Virginia has assets that are jurisdictional to West Virginia and Ohio. So Massachusetts today could share with New Hampshire, Maine, a generating resource, and you could call it our energy reserve and rate base it or do it through a PPA. So I'd like to hear more commentary from you and everybody else who wants to talk about this idea, which is a very specific idea, which we came here to talk about specific ideas, and your governors, I think, appropriately raised it. Of course, the question is who pays, and if you rate pay it as consumers. And by the way, the California Reliability Reserve, they're paying through taxpayers. Not through ratepayers, but taxpayers.
Right.
So anyway, more on that from you. I'd love to hear, and anyone else about that. Your states today can do it today. You don't need US DOE to do it for you.
Absolutely, and similar to how there has been a determination under our Restructuring Act of how the EDCs can participate in on supply side arrangements on gas. But really, we want to get the composition of this right. What's the scale? What is the cost? I think we need to go to, before we develop this, what kind of magnitude are we really talking about, and how much insurance do we want to purchase? That goes to, I think, some of the technical support we'd want from DOE and FERC. But clearly, the DOE does have the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve. So that was one option that we thought that you could build upon to see about products that could fit into an electrical reliability emergency rather than a disruption in heating oil supplies, which was the purpose of that when it was authorized in 2001. But we've looked at, Germany has moved forward with the strategic gas reserve very quickly in context of the Russian situation. I think first thing is, what is the scale, what is the magnitude, and then how can we work with our governors to say, and the federal government, of who should be under the jurisdiction. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I think we need to get the specifics of the composition correct first.
Well, I would just add this. Yes, and you mentioned Germany. Germany's reopened coal plants, by the way, which 6 months ago they wouldn't have ever dreamed about, but reality hit them in the face. But back to you. Jurisdictionally, I mean, it's not hard. You don't need technical assistance. I mean, you build a plant, you make it jurisdictional to 2 states, and you either rate base it or PPA it, and it's just regular cost of service regulation. I mean, it's not technically hard, I can tell you. There's technical advice right there.
Appreciate that. I mean, first of all, 6 New England states, you need 6 regulatory processes.
Not if you do 2 states.
I mean, we may be able to work this out later this afternoon, but
right.
Honestly, really, what is the scale of what we're talking about? And this is an idea. It is not a proposal at this point. We need to get this into a proposal form. And, is it a mixture of clean energy resources, LNG, propane, distillate fuels? What's the right mix? What is the most appropriate benefit for the least cost?
Well, 1 state can do it or 2 states can do it. There's no magic number. Believe me, Virginia has it with with West Virginia, and it's just 2 states, and you just share jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think, we all benefit when we would not limit the benefits if Massachusetts were to release a energy reserve that is being paid for by our electric customers onto our grid during an energy emergency. And I think, it'd be up, I think Massachusetts electric distribution companies would certainly say that, all states should participate in type of a structure like that. So I think at the very least we would want to, and let me be clear, 6 New England governors that signed that letter.
Okay.
The reserve idea is so enticing, but it is so prickly. Who makes the decision of what to procure? LNG doesn't have a long shelf life. So who makes the decision to buy it, how much, whom to release it to, which plants? Who pays for that? Who pays for the bad decisions? And I won't fight you too much about markets, but that's what the markets do, is that those people that are best equipped to make that decision will try, and we all think we're smarter than each other, right? I say this all the time. That's why we're in this business. And the funny thing is we all have different strategies, and we all think that we're smarter than the other. We're all executing different strategies, but that's more, I think, an efficient way of trying to solve the problem than this massive sort of governmental controlled reserve that I just see as looming costs, very difficult to manage. Again, who do you allocate it to? Do you favor a state? Which consumers pay for it? It's just very thorny, but attractive.
Now that's a combination.
Thank you. I think Margie has given me a softball this time, because she's teed up really a few of the issues surrounding the strategic reserve. And as a company, we don't have a position on that at this point. But I think one of the threshold issues, and one that's been looming over this forum, has been, what's the future of the Everett Marine Terminal and the RMR agreement? And I mean, the simplest solution going forward, if it's needed, if that marine terminal is needed, extend the RMR agreement. And whether that comes with the generation or not with the generation is a question. It's not, because the transmission was supposed to obviate, which is going in place, was to obviate the need for the generation. So then the question is, well, what does an RMR agreement look like? Is it just fuel? Is it fuel for the Mystic units? Or is it fuel for the region, or what is it? So, you know, I think approaching the strategic reserve thorny issues, I think a lot of those questions need to be answered. And I think it's your jurisdiction as to what the answer is, whether you would extend an RMR agreement and what it would look like. And then I think the states would probably look at the alternatives as a strategic reserve through that lens. I mean, that's just my own view of it. I mean, I think those are some of the issues that Margie is raising, is how, before you go to all of that, in terms of designing a strategic reserve, who makes decisions, how is the cost allocated, you need to look at it as to say, well, what process do we have in place today, and why doesn't that work? Or what modifications are needed to that process that spreads those costs all over the region. Nobody wants to pay for them. That's the way RMRs are, just like strategic reserves would be too. But at least you have one entity in charge of it, so you might actually get to a solution. And this is an interim solution as well, which might, you know, temper what you could do while we get those longer-term solutions in place. So I just raise you know, there's a significant fog over how we go forward, and that RMR agreement and where it ultimately ends up is a significant piece of fog. I will say, though, as an LDC company, you know, we have been a customer out of that marine terminal for many, many years, and we do have a need for support for the services that it brings. So we have a need, and I wanted to make sure that was visible here. We have a need, as John Rudiak said at the previous panel, the LDCs have a need for that terminal as well. So they have an interest in how this gets resolved, and the 2 years remaining on the RMR is really important to those LDCs and how they provision for the gas. So what we don't want to see is a problem on the electric side translate into something that's a problem now on the gas side, which was working fairly well, but now gets entangled and embroiled in and reduces two industries to subpar reliability. So there is a serious need to get clarity on some of these issues immediately. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Commissioner Christie.
We got one more.
I apologize.
Thanks. Yeah, just it sounds like the concept of the energy reserve is based on the notion that, you know, the LDCs have some amount of their demand that can't be filled with the pipeline system, and you know, there's this you know, desire to maintain reliability, and the resources that you have that show up are, you know, maybe enough to meet your likely peak requirements, but not enough to give you that insurance that you need to maintain a high level of reliability in the electric market. I think, so, I mean, it seems to me it's really just the sum of those two things. And in the case of the LDCs and the states that are involved, it seems like there are, you know, several options that they have for entering into contracts with LNG terminals. You know, and I'm not sure what prevents them from doing that, but when it comes to the electric piece, because you know, really the total need is the sum of those things. Really, the perceived need for that is just the gap between what your current you know, what your current market framework gives you without any specific requirement for winter reliability versus what you actually need to meet a high level of reliability criteria. And you know, it's actually not that much if you think about it. It's you know, because 90% of the requirement or more is going to be met by these other kinds of resources. So you just need a capacity market design that motivates generators to go out and contract with not all of the LNG terminals, but just some portion that's necessary to meet those peaking requirements under a extreme weather condition. And if the capacity market compensates them, based on the higher capacity accreditation that they should receive for having the fuel available, then there's going to be an impetus there for them to go sign contracts with LNG terminals. And I think you accomplish what is maybe the objective of the energy reserve, but you do that in a way that's doesn't utilize an out-of-market contract, because the problem with the out-of-market contract is it's going to devalue the investments of everyone else, like the oil units particularly, who for whom it's going to be costly to enter into supply arrangements that actually keep those filled. So if there's a desire to meet that higher planning standard, it's really better to do that through the capacity market and some as well as what the LDC actions that I mentioned.
Thanks. So I got a couple questions. I did want to come back to what you just said in a second, but if it's okay, I want to go back to transmission for a second, and Ms. Phillips, I'm going to call you Margie, but Ms. Phillips. So you said, well, why are we talking about transmission? Because we need to bring in dispatchable resources. I mean, I'm a little confused by that statement because, I mean, yes, transmission is needed to bring in, for instance, offshore wind, or even bring in other maybe renewable resources from elsewhere as well. But you need, I mean, the transmission that we're talking about is also beneficial in terms of bringing in the hydro from Quebec, which again is I think that's generally a dispatchable resource. And then secondly, and this is what I really wanted to focus on, is we had our transmission task force meetings with the states. The most recent one, a lot of discussion about interregional transfer capacity. And you again look at the Texas example. It's a perfect example of what happened during Winter Storm Uri. Don't have a lot of transfer capacity. Things go wrong in your balancing area, ERCOT. Things go really wrong. Versus SPP and MISO, they were able to import power from elsewhere, primarily PJM, but elsewhere as well. Now I know that sometimes when it's cold here, it can be cold in New York and so on, but not all the time. And there are different weather patterns. And so why, you look at the map, and I was, talking to Mr. Dunn about this yesterday, but why is it, if Vermont's right next to New York, for instance, why don't we have more transfer capacity why don't we build more transfer capacity between Vermont and New York, or New York and Vermont, New York and New England, and New York and Massachusetts for that matter? And so then we provide a little bit more of an insurance against a very cold weather event.
So one, just to be clear, I did say transmission was part of the solution. Two, let me make, I think this is the most critical point that is overlooking this discussion. The goal is to have every single hour where it's clean energy running. The reality is that's not reality. And that's the piece we're solving for. We're not solving for the everyday energy hours. I think what we're talking about here are the hours in which that energy is not available because of the hurricane. So that's why I made the reference about bringing in more renewables is not going to solve the energy security. It's a better way to get to a clean transition, no doubt, and that's the hope. But as we talked about, hope is not necessarily a good solution. So the issue, I think, about transfers is, one, you're right, PJM came very close to saving MISO and SPP, but there comes to a point, I think, with greater electrification. Frankly, PJM's not going to have this problem because there's states that allow for gas pipelines and all of that, and it's a very resource diverse, and so you're not going to have this. At some point, PJM's made it clear they're concerned they may not be able to export. And frankly, some of the states we've seen don't particularly want to support power plants in their state, whatever the origin, and that power is shipped out somewhere else. So it becomes a cost issue. So I'm just trying to make the point that it's complicated. It's not a panacea. It's part of the solution, but I don't think it's going to solve your energy security issue in New England.
I would just say quickly, there's not anything we've talked about today. There's not one magic bullet. There's not one thing that's going to solve everything. But I would suggest that transmission can play a very important role.
I would also note, however, the big thing that transmission is not going to get you is black start. And black start is local, and we haven't even begun to talk about that today, but that's a very important resource for critical infrastructure security, and transmission is not going to get you that. And of course, we also know with transmission there starts to be, now I'm getting really wonky, but you know, there's losses, so it's maybe not the most efficient approach. But I don't mean to diminish it, it's just not the solution.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Dunn?
Yeah, I think that's a great question about why aren't we seeing more. I mean, I think Commissioner Danley was hit on it. It's hard to do. It's hard to cite a pass-through line in a state. There has to be commensurate benefits for hosting the line, and that's a difficult challenge. But I would look at things like Phase 2 that was built in the 1980s that goes from Quebec all the way down to Sandy Pond. And in that instance, there's 50 miles of that in Vermont. We've had that for 40-something years. I think the secret to that success was a collaboration among a number of parties, and the sharing of benefits and costs allowed that to happen. The other element, I think, in the direction that is we're looking at in terms of planning, that is, I say, the Commission and others, to expand how we define what's involved in evaluating transmission projects. And again, moving from historic approach to one that has state policies and other aspects considered. And I think that opens the door for projects that are more interregional opportunities. Yeah, and the only other thing I would note, I just share, some of you may know that there is a 1,000-megawatt transmission project that's been permitted in Vermont to connect Quebec to Velco's grid. That project's, ready to go.
Thank you. Ms. Burchard?
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's some arguing about fine details, but the reality is that, of course, transmission can help reduce reliance on gas. We heard this morning about the offshore wind that is ginned up and will be coming to New England in the very near future. Every incremental addition of something like offshore wind that blows strong in the winter, even to the extent that we're still using gas for this reliability purpose, it will reduce that reliance on gas, make more of that available for other purposes. To the longer term view of how do we get toward a higher penetration of renewables while maintaining reliability, that also requires transmission, of course, so that we can have a balanced portfolio of complementary renewables, so that we have the resources that balance each other out, and you'll need some additional sources of balancing, including energy storage and other resources. But transmission is an essential piece of that. It's not going to happen overnight. So again, there's this question of what's the near term, medium term, and long term. That goes to the strategic energy reserve concept too. What are we trying to solve for that? We need to be clear what we're trying to solve for before we start proposing solutions. You're not going to get a pipeline quicker than you're going to get transmission. You need to get this renewable energy online as quickly as possible. And in the near term, you need to look to as many of the low-hanging fruit, and that includes the demand response, that includes the energy storage, that includes the targeted energy efficiency. And there was a comment earlier about, demand response is a state program. Actually, the states and the state utilities get the signals that they need to provide those services in the summer, and they're not getting those same signals from the regional level in the winter. So that kind of coordination and talking to each other, and not just turning to the fossil fuel solutions, but thinking, near term, what can we do, and how can we pull that low-hanging fruit from the trees, and then next, what's the next step, longer term?
Thank you. You mentioned storage, and I wanted to turn to that for a second. Storage and demand response as well. So we saw, obviously, incredibly hot this week in California. The ISO there has been doing a tremendous job of just, barely keeping the lights on, but they're doing it so far, and hopefully that will continue on for this week until the weather gets a little cooler. But some of the things we've seen, and admittedly, they're quick responses, but it appears that two of the factors that have led to them being able to keep the lights on and avoid rolling blackouts are demand response and storage, energy storage. And I spoke to the head of the ISO there a couple weeks ago. He said energy storage has been just tremendous. It's performed tremendously in terms of helping them out throughout the summer. And I think it appears, based on a lot of it, admittedly, I'm reading on Twitter, but it appears that storage provided a significant benefit there. So maybe I can start with storage, then go to demand response in a second. But I know that New England's different. Obviously, it's also, we're talking about very cold weather, and I imagine batteries, at least with my hybrid electric vehicle, that I don't get nearly the mileage that I do in the summer than I do in the winter. I get less mileage in the winter. But Ms. Delaney, I was wondering if you might be able to talk about some of the benefits of storage in terms of helping with this particular issue.
Thanks for the question. I thought it was interesting this morning when somebody noted that there wasn't readily available utility scale storage, and I thought, well, have they looked at the queues and have they looked at California? There's a close to 6,000 megawatts of storage in the New England queue right now. Developers are moving full force because they recognize that it can be a very, very valuable capacity resource. Now, the point that you made, Chair Glick, is a good one, that in a long duration winter cold snap, battery storage alone is not going to be your solution, but it is part of the suite of solutions. And I would argue that for the rest of the year, when a lot of the variability that we're looking at is intraday, it's the perfect solution. So I think our fear that battery storage can't solve it all impacts our perception of the potential for the resource to contribute to the energy transition and to contribute to reliability.
Ms. Phillips.
Well, I just can't help bragging about my company. We, in 2020, energized the world's largest battery storage project in California. And this is the problem. The money is there in California. You have the duck curve, the infamous duck curve. So what happens is during the day, there's so much clean energy that's when we charge our battery. We're charging it like we're doing the system a favor by charging it. And then when all of the generation, the solar, just disappears, prices pop, and they pop. And that's frankly where we make our money. You don't see that. There's not enough penetration here, and so we get back to missing money on the Northeast. We have projects in the queue, but we struggle because either we're going to need a heftier capacity payment, which we haven't even begun to talk about the need for in this. I know that's a separate technical conference, but that's part of the problem. We hear about resources retiring and yada, yada, yada. We have a problem with the capacity payments are too low. But battery storage right now, short of scarcity pricing, which we don't really see in New England or any of the eastern RTOs, makes it simply much more difficult to finance a large-scale battery storage project. Hopefully that will change, and with the economics, and also hopefully the technology will get more sophisticated. There are developers out there who recognize they need to develop longer-term battery storage, but it's about the missing money that makes those projects financeable and feasible.
Mr. Woodcock?
So short duration storage has been a critical part of Massachusetts public policy. We require it for all of our solar projects over 500 kilowatts. We saw what happened in California. We wanted to get ahead of that curve. I do think when you start talking about applying that to the situations that we're talking about, MIT came out with a storage report for this region, and it really highlights the distinction between energy density and power density. And what you really need is strong megawatt hours that can deliver long duration. You do. And I do think that there are some fundamentals that can work in New England. We are about to have a different type of seasonality discharge with our offshore wind resource. The difference between New England and California is seasons. We're going to have very low demand, high production of offshore wind, low negative pricing of electricity. This is what came with the analysis group's recent report. That is a good mixture of creating some nice fundamentals for long duration storage. So I'm optimistic on that. What's the time frame? There are some federal resources that are available, but I think that's a 5-10 year time frame for really being available at a material level.
Mr. Dunn?
I wanted to speak to some work that's underway here in Vermont with a number of partners, and it relates to flexible load management and developing that capability. Velco has a pretty extensive fiber optic network that we use to operate the grid. It provides great high-speed, secure networks. It also gives us the ability to get more visibility into the grid. So we are using that platform along with some partners, including the Pacific Northwest National Labs and others, to look at the data we're getting and create the ability to transfer that data, to use that data, to make it on we're working with them on the common information model, so that, and working with our DU partners to help develop more flexible demand. Again, back to the portfolio approach, it's not a silver bullet, but I think it's tremendously exciting about thinking about a future where demand is far more responsive than it is today. And the other, quite frankly, is I don't think we can afford to build a grid without a huge amount of flexible demand.
And that's a good transition into my last, I'm going to try to rush through it because I know we're running over a little bit. Actually, Ms. Bouchard and Mr. Woodcock, maybe, and others as well, if you're interested. So we talked a lot about demand response. We're talking about it on the electricity side. There was a Brattle study, a Brattle Group study, I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago, that examined the potential for demand response on the natural gas side, in New England in particular. And if I recall right, I may be wrong with the number, but they were saying up to $70 million potential savings annually associated with demand response on the gas side. Now, admittedly, we don't have the structure like we have an RTO on the gas side, and I don't know, maybe there may be some other issues as well. But I'm curious if your groups or offices have given any thought to doing some more on demand response in New England and on the gas side, and whether that might actually make a dent in this problem. Do you want to start, Mr. Daly?
Okay, so we run 3 gas LDC companies, and under state regulations, we file plans with the states for approval every couple of years with these LDCs. Demand response is definitely part of the resource planning that we use. So unlike the power or the EDC business, the gas LDC business has a portfolio of resources, and demand response and energy efficiency is part of those resources. So all the forecasts we plan for on the supply side all are net of these programs. So we have some, very, I would say aggressive targets in these areas that are funded by the gas LDCs. In terms of energy efficiency, insulation, but also on the demand response side, is coming up more. I mean, it hasn't been huge on the demand response side, but we're getting there with our state regulators and looking at opportunities which include fuel switching, et cetera. Some of this is now being overcome by electrification, which involves heat pumps that can be dual fired as well. So I'm sure there are opportunities for more to be done, and we are examining those with our state regulators as an opportunity. But some of this goes to do the gas companies have, can they free up spare capacity to go to the power generation side? And that question, the gas LDCs have very, very modest growth rates, and the gas companies are small relative to the power industry. So one of the questions I was asked, that very question, I said, well, we have 50,000 decatherms maybe of growth potential at a gas LDC in a state. One power plant would require over 100,000 decatherms, and a few power plants would require, New England needs a BCF. So you're talking about 50,000 decatherms that would stretch over 5-10 years. Versus a BCF need for the power generation. It gets gobbled up in no time. So it's a very small resource relative to the size of demand on the power side. So just clarification.
Thanks. Ms. Bouchard?
Thank you. Yes, first I want to just give credit to the gas and electric utilities in the region for doing a really great job, and the states for doing a really great job of proving the benefits of energy efficiency and demand response. Including, not only on the electric side, but also on the gas side. So thank you for that. There is a great deal of potential in this area, including potential that could be targeted specifically to the winter. So again, we need stronger signals for specific kinds of measures that can provide a strategic benefit specifically in the winter. We have some of those things in the summer. We don't have them in the winter. So some of these measures may already be in place, or programs may be in place to put the measures there in people's homes and businesses, but they can be ramped up very quickly with in the near term with the right signals from the regional level that say, this is the reliability benefit of those measures, and therefore they will be compensated for that benefit, which is something that's happening again in the summertime, and it is not happening in the wintertime. So the first thing to do is to say, what do we actually get for our electric system when we implement these measures? And once you identify that, you can compensate it appropriately and then put it in place more quickly.
Thank you. Mr. Woodcock.
Just quickly, I think we're scratching just the surface of the opportunities here. Let's be clear, LDCs have focused on stable pipeline capacity to serve load, and they were a component of meeting public policy goals. And we have a docket in Massachusetts, The Future of Gas, that ultimately I could see dispatching, demand response at different service levels in the distribution system, where you could have alternatives to additional compression. You could look at substitutes, looking at geothermal, looking at hydrogen on the system that really serves to optimize how we think about meeting peak load and meeting least cost service. I really don't think we've even started in this realm.
Thank you. Well, in the interest of time, I want to ask any more questions. It's 3:15 now. We were supposed to start the next panel, I believe, at 3:15, but we're going to take a 5-minute break and come back at 3:20 if that's okay with everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Very nice meeting you.